The first theory that we're going to look at is uses and gratifications theory, which is an active audience theory. And this is a theory by two media theorists, Bloomer and Katz. They suggested that audiences are really active in choosing the text that they're interested in. And they suggested that audiences pick these texts because they gratify them, they interest them in some way. So the first one of the reasons that they suggested is personal relationships, which is the idea that audiences would consume a text because they develop a relationship with a character in the text. So say, for example, a teenage girl might buy a magazine because Justin Bieber's on the front cover and they feel like they have a relationship with Justin Bieber. Now, it doesn't mean that they literally think that they are in a relationship with him. It just means that they have kind of got an investment in him, as if he were somebody that they genuinely care about. It could also be something like you might watch a television program. You might have watched The Bodyguard, for example, because you built up a relationship with the character played by Richard Madden, and you wanted to see how it turned out for him. The second reason that audiences might consume a text is personal identity, which is where you identify with an ideology or a message that the text promotes. So, for example, if you were feeling particularly sad because you just split up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you might listen to Adele for a bit because it's full of kind of sad love songs. Okay. A third reason kind of contradicts this. It's diversion. So the idea behind this, the idea behind this would be, sorry, I've had to put on my knee because she won't stop clacking about and it kind of ruins the microphone. The idea behind diversion is that you would select a media text to kind of distract you from what's going on in the real world. So, for example, if you were taking a long train journey, you might stick your headphones on and listen to an album or a podcast. You might read a magazine, or instead of listening to sad songs because you've just been dumped, you might listen to something really upbeat to kind of distract you and cheer you up. So kind of the opposite in some ways to personal identity on that one. The last reason that Bloomer and Katz suggested audiences might select texts is surveillance. Now, this used to be kind of quite limited to newspapers and radio and TV news. However, with the advent of social media, increasingly audiences are likely to use the internet and social media pages like Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook. Surveillance is just finding out what's going on in the world, and that can be as kind of global as finding out that, sorry, dogs just fell over. That can be as global as finding out that a tsunami has just hit Asia. It can be as local as finding out that the mayor is going to be opening a new shopping centre in your local town. It could even be personal surveillance, so that idea of finding out what's going on with a drama that someone in your class or your school or your friend is going through. But the main thing that you've got to get your head around with uses and gratifications theory is that it is very much an active audience theory. And Bloomer and Katz really feel that audiences are very proactive in choosing the text that they want. Hypodermic needle theory is a really simplistic media theory, and it's one that I wouldn't suggest that you overly use when you're applying theory to text because it's so simplistic. Hypodermic needle theory or hypodermic syringe theory is the idea that an audience is very, very passive and are kind of blindly injected with the ideologies of the text that they consume. Hypodermic needle theory is frequently used in the media to kind of scaremonger and create panic, and I'll talk a little bit about moral panic in a moment. Hypodermic needle theory is quite useful to think about if you are looking at tabloid texts, and we'll have a look at some of those shortly. But it basically takes the idea that, for example, if an audience read a headline about immigration in the right-wing press, so for example, the Daily Mail or the Sun, and the headline said something about the fact that 100,000 immigrants flood our shores, that really emotive language. The idea would be that an audience, if hypodermic needle theory was to be believed, would simply accept that was true. And not only would they accept that that was true, but they would also experience the feelings that the media producer wants them to feel, so the kind of horror and panic and revulsion. Now, the next step from hypodermic needle theory is copycat theory, which is very closely linked with Bandura's social effects theory. And this is very much the idea is that it's the monkey see, monkey do thing. And in many ways, actually, it is quite applicable to young children. The idea that not only would the audience see the text, consume and accept the ideologies and the messages, but they would then go on to mimic or to copy them themselves. One example of this that was really popularised in the press was a Video Nasties campaign, and I've done a PowerPoint about this if you want to have a look at it, because it's so exciting. But the Video Nasties campaign was something in the British press, primarily the Sun newspaper, in the early 1990s, after the murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. Now, the nation were absolutely shocked at the murder of James, because not only was it incredibly brutal and sadistic and really horrible murder of a 2-year-old, but the killers were children. It was a 10 and 11-year-old boy who tortured and killed James after having taken him from his mum in a local shopping centre. And the judge who was presiding over the boys' trial before they were sentenced made much of the fact that these children are likely to have had access to quite explicit and graphic media texts. Child's Play 3 was one that was mentioned. And it led to a moral panic, an absolute overreaction, suggesting that we need to ban all of these texts because they've caused these children to go on and systematically torture and kill a baby. Now, there's massive flaws in that, and again, that's something I think that we would probably want to talk about a little bit more. But just be very careful when applying copycat theory or hypodermic needle theory. You are really thinking about very vulnerable audiences in particular who would likely to be going on to blindly accept and to copy what they see in the media. So we are thinking about people who are mentally ill or very young children. Beyond that, many people would argue that it's unlikely that the majority of audiences would be so passive. Okay, so when we were talking about hypodermic needle theory and copycat theory, I did mention Bandura and social effects theory, which was a very controversial study done in a laboratory by a psychologist called Albert Bandura. Bandura filmed adults and children kind of interacting with this Bobo doll. And what actually happened was the children watched the adults playing with this Bobo doll, but being very, very rough, beating it, kicking it, being very violent with it. And then the adults left the room. Now, the children, as soon as the adults left the room, began to play in the same sort of way, being incredibly violent and kind of kicking the doll. And Bandura's argument was very much what we talked about in terms of copycat theory, that the children have seen it, so then they've gone on to do it themselves. Got to be very careful with this study. It was conducted in a laboratory. So in terms of real world validity and reliability, you've not necessarily got something that's accurate. Something that the way that you behave in a laboratory during an experiment, for example, is likely to be really different to the way that you would behave in the real world when you didn't feel you were being observed. The very nature of the experiment, the fact that the children were almost set up to carry out that behaviour. You could argue that the children were positioned to feel that they were expected to behave just as the adults did. So there are some flaws in that sense. There are also real moral flaws in that, is it ethical for adults to behave that way in front of children, thereby endorsing violence? Probably not. It's quite an old theory. We're talking 1960s, so it's not something that would necessarily be passed nowadays by the BPS, who would vet these kinds of studies. You also need to make sure that you remember, if you are using Bandura to support any of your points, that Bandura used a fairly small sample group. There were 36 boys and 36 girls, so it's unlikely that could be deemed statistically significant. So while Bandura is certainly an interesting theory, and it certainly tells us things about the way that audiences respond to what they see, be very careful about using it as absolute proof for any points that you make. Okay, two-step flow is another audience theory, and again, this is an active audience theory to a degree. Okay, this is active because it suggests that while audiences might not necessarily be completely influenced by the messages in the text itself, they are very much influenced by other consumers of the text. Okay, so two-step flow works on the principle that you can have what's called an opinion leader. Okay, so an example of this would be my friend Debbie would be an opinion leader when it comes to the horror genre. All right, not only does she love horror, but she has a real kind of intellectual understanding of where the horror genre has come from, how it's developed, and so on. So if Debbie said to me that there is a new horror film at the cinema that is really good, I'd be really likely to think, yeah, it will be good then. I would be much more likely to go and see it than I would have been otherwise, because I really accept that Debbie's an opinion leader in that area. She knows what she's talking about. The same thing works with film critics as well. Quite often, if you are debating going to watch something at the cinema or looking at something on Netflix, you might ask your friends what they think of it. And again, you'd be likely to pick people who you would regard as having opinions that you would trust, because they know what they're talking about in that area. Okay. In terms of film reviews, you may well click on sites like Rotten Tomatoes to gauge how interesting you think the film is likely to be to you based on the opinion leaders there. This is the reason things like awards work, as well as them being kind of recognised in the industry as being important. You think of I, Daniel Blake, which won the Palme d'Or award. That's massive in terms of that critical appeal. That in effect acts as a kind of opinion leader, because it stands for all the people in the film industry who have said that Daniel Blake is something that is really valid and is really worth watching. So your opinion leader would be deemed as very much active. They are the one who is going and seeing a text or listening to a text and having that very strong opinion and passing that on to people. Your other audience members who listen to the opinion leader are less active, because they are, to a degree, overly influenced by the opinion leader. However, they are not entirely passive, because the argument would be they are still seeking out the opinions of somebody that they have judged to be expert. So it's a little bit of a funny one, two-step flow. It doesn't fall neatly into passive or active, but it's a very good one to use, and it's very much common sense. It's something that you'll probably feel you do all the time. So Stuart Hall's reception theory is a really important one to know. Hall argued that when audiences select and consume a text, they position themselves according to their own ideologies, their own beliefs, because we do, of course, all have our own belief system, and we are likely, Hall argued, to not accept texts that have really different ideologies or belief systems to our own. So Hall argued that audiences would take one of three positions when they're consuming a text. He said that they would either accept the ideologies, and they would take the preferred reading. So in other words, if I watched a film like Straight Outta Compton, the ideology, the message that those producers, and we all know why, why they wanted to present this aspect, they wanted us to believe that the police were incredibly corrupt, that the gang members were subject to brutalisation, it was very unfair treatment, and so on. So a preferred reading would be that I would watch that film and I would think, this is terrible. The police are incredibly corrupt. How awful. And that is very much the stance that those producers would want me to take. However, I may watch Straight Outta Compton and think, this doesn't add up, this doesn't make sense at all. I do not believe that any police force would be this corrupt. And I would think, no, hang on a minute, these men are dealing drugs, they're violent, they're carrying guns, and that would be an oppositional reading. I would not be viewing the gang members, the band members, as heroes. I would be viewing them as criminal. Okay, so that's the oppositional reading. So they're sort of quite clear, your preferred and your oppositional. Now, the one that people get muddled with is the negotiated reading, because sometimes people misread this and they say that it's just that you kind of sit in the middle and you agree with some of it and you don't agree with some of it, and it's not quite that. Hall suggested that your negotiated reading is that you take the elements of the text that fit with your own ideologies, and that's the really important bit. You've got to talk about this idea of how the text's ideologies fit with the audience members. So using Straight Outta Compton again, I might watch that, and my own ideologies, I'm supportive of the police. I think generally that our police force do a very good job in this country. So I would potentially watch Straight Outta Compton, and I would see that those particular characters were not treated very well by the police, and there did seem to be a racial divide. However, I wouldn't look at that and immediately think and accept that all police are corrupt. I would look and say there potentially was an element of corruption at that time in that country. However, do I accept that all police are corrupt? No, I don't, because I've negotiated that to fit with my own personal ideologies, because I am quite pro-police and I'm supportive of what they do. Another really useful theory is Clay Shirky's end of audience theory, and although this is a fairly simple and straightforward theory, it's actually a really useful and a really valid one, I think, which you'll find very useful when we look at online texts such as Zoella and also newspapers and magazines. Shirky basically argued that there is no longer such a thing as a passive audience. He believed that technology, and in particular the internet, has been absolutely instrumental in changing the way that audiences respond to texts. Whereas 15 years ago, if you were consuming a text, you would have the opportunity to maybe discuss it afterwards with friends. That would be about it. You may, if you felt particularly strongly, want to write to the production company. However, nowadays, think about the degree of interaction that goes on after or while you're consuming a media text. Online platforms such as Instagram have pages specifically devoted to texts that they know are likely to generate a lot of consumer engagement. So, for example, Love Island or The Apprentice or X Factor there are pages set up for consumers to directly interact. not only are audiences more able to interact around the text that they've seen, but media consumers can also become producers and distributors themselves now. As I'm doing right now, people can film themselves running tutorials or creating vlogs, and that would have never been an option 15, 20 years ago. So there is less of a divide between the audience and the production than there has perhaps ever been before, and that is very much what Shirky's end of audience theory is all about. Another really important audience theory is George Gerbner's cultivation theory. Now, cultivation research is quite controversial. It studies media effects on consumers or on audiences, and cultivation theorists like Gerbner suggest that television viewing can have long-term effects on audiences over time. And one such effect is the belief that the world created by the television is accurate and true. Gerbner suggested that prolonged watching of television can tend to induce a certain belief or a set of beliefs about, in particular, violence in the world. And theorists like Gerbner tend to break down the effects of cultivation into two distinct levels. So the first order is a kind of general belief about the world. And then the second order are these specific attitudes, such as extreme hatred for criminals, for example, or for people who are violent. And then conversely, a real reverence or admiration for kind of law and order. Okay. Now, this theory is extended largely to look at all media texts. So for the purposes of you, when you're analysing your media text and you're looking at this concept of cultivation, what you should be particularly focusing on is the idea that when someone is continually exposed to a certain ideology or a certain message, it can change their own attitude and their own belief system. But it's unlikely that anyone who has been cultivated in such a way would actually recognise that that is the case. The suggestion, Gerbner posits, is that they would instead believe that was their own part of their identity, that it was their own belief system, and that what they see on television simply endorses their own set of beliefs. Gerbner argues that is not in fact the case, that particular set of beliefs has been cultivated or grown as a result of the media that that particular audience member has consumed. One really interesting aspect of cultivation theory is the perspective that heavy viewers can develop, which has been dubbed mean world syndrome. And mean world syndrome is basically the perspective that can be developed having watched a significant amount of television that can support this idea. And it's simply the perspective that the world is a much more dangerous place than it really is. The perspective that there is a murderer or a rapist or a paedophile lurking around every corner, and that you are simply not safe anymore. Another theory that looks at the effects of repeated exposure to a particular ideology or representation over time is desensitization theory. Now, desensitization theory looks at content that is particularly violent or graphic or sexual. And the suggestion is that if an audience consumes a text that is particularly violent, for example, they may initially be quite shocked by that. They might be offended. It might make them have a physical response. They might feel sick. However, over time, they will gradually become less and less shocked by the degree of violence that they see in text, until in the end they will be able to consume some quite significant violent or gory text and actually not feel any kind of response to it. Another way that desensitisation theory, or inoculation theory as it's sometimes known, is used to explain human responses to media text is when looking at criminal behaviour. So if we are taking, for example, violence in text, it may be likely that an audience member who derives sexual pleasure from watching a violent film would increasingly need more and more and more of that violence to get the same thrill as they initially did. The same goes for degrees of violence in pornography and child pornography as well. The suggestion is that the consumer becomes increasingly desensitised to what they've seen and heard, and increasingly seek out more and more depraved viewing, with, of course, the ultimate desensitisation leading to them needing to physically go and enact the things that they have seen in order to get the same level of response.